it's an early text-based RPG on Facebook. It's Mafia-themed, where players basically level up and fight each other and collect weapons and collect city properties and stuff. I guess it's similar to like a MUD or something, just like text-based. There were images and pictures and stuff, but it's all basically programmer art. I would say it was, at the time, really a novelty as well as something that took advantage of the viral channels of Facebook. So you just click attack. I mean, it's another very simple game. You can see if you won or lost. You can see what they're armed with, and that's the game.
We are very professional, only one mic in this company. So how did you come up with the idea? Like, what inspired you to build this particular game?
So there's kind of a long history of stuff. So I was working at a company called FreeWebs at the time. Does anyone know FreeWebs is like early, like kind of GeoCities type thing? And there's a guy there, TJ Murphy, who made a game called Warbook. Does anyone remember Warbook on Facebook? Anyway, that was really one of the first text-based games on Facebook. And I saw TJ build this game, and I don't really know how well it actually did, but I saw that it had some users. So it let me know that something was viable, right? But the idea for Mob Wars itself actually came from a web search for a text-based game, because I knew that I could build a text-based game. I knew it was possible, because I was a web developer, I wasn't a game developer. So the idea came from this web search, and what mostly came up were Mafia-themed text-based games. So that was kind of what led me to choose the theme, and that led to everything else. One approach that I took that was different, I think, is I didn't look at any of the games that were there for more than about a minute, where I kind of got the idea of what it was and how they worked, and then went with that, as opposed to kind of studying them and taking all the details of the game. And I think that's what led to the uniqueness of Mob Wars.
So do you remember those games that people had on their TI 80-something calculators? Mm-hmm. Did you ever play one of those games? Do you remember, was it similar to those? Or?
So who remembers Dope Wars on the TI 83, 85? Yeah. So that was, I guess that's the original inspiration. I actually used to make TI 85 games. I made a game where you were a sumo wrestler and you had to level up and do all these things and compete as a sumo wrestler. So I guess I had actually made a text-based game way before that. And the TI-85 was particularly easy to make a text-based game because it had this kind of easy menu system. Who's ever actually programmed a TI game? One person, okay.
Okay. So was that your first web-based game, Mob Wars? And how long did it take you to go from like doing that web search to find, hey, Mafia games could be an interesting game, to actually launching it?
So I've been a web developer for, I think, like 5 or 6 years at that point. So I had a lot of built-up knowledge, and I had a lot of built-up code that I had built, like frameworks that I had built myself to make web development easier. So I think that accelerated the development of the game itself. I forget what the question was.
The other one, how long did it take?
Oh, it actually took 2 weeks to build it, and 4 years to finish it. So the story behind actually the creating of it is interesting, because I didn't kind of just create it because I kind of had this idea that I wanted to create. I was in between apartments at the time, so I had nowhere to live, and I had a friend who had an apartment downtown, and it was empty. So I was like, can I stay at your place? It's just completely empty, nobody lived there. So I was staying at this completely empty apartment, and all I had was my laptop. So that's kind of what led to, I gotta create something. So that's how I created it. And I don't know if I would have created it if I had not been that bored.
Most people would just go to IKEA.
It was temporary.
Before YouTube, and this was before the iPhone existed, so there were no, right?
Yeah, and I also had no internet, so that's a key factor.
So, so you just built the whole thing, I mean, you launched it after 2 weeks, or?
Roughly, somewhere around
Okay,
there.
roughly 2 weeks. And how long did it take before you had, your first, I mean, this was the very early stage of the Facebook platform. I don't know, I think it was probably, pretty open. There were not that many apps. So, how long did it take for you to actually get users and figure out that, hey, this is actually a thing, like people are using this?
Mm-hmm. It's hard to actually remember the actual details, but I remember it had something like a few hundred users, and then like the next day it had a few hundred more users. And the only metrics I had to look at, I had no analytics. All I had was a MySQL database that I could query and see how many users I had, how many total user IDs were in the database. So I actually had no idea if it was growing or not. I think at the time Facebook was tracking DAU, so I did have a metric there, but I really don't remember what that was. But I would say it seemed to have real traction within a few, like maybe a month of launching it. I could tell that it was something. And in terms of revenue, that actually took much longer to make any money off it at all. But
so, I mean, what were your costs like, and at what point did you have to throw, either real hardware or really start thinking about scaling your back end? Like when you finally hit that point where they're, hey, that thing's not going to run on the $15 a month shared server. Yeah. Do you remember? I vaguely remember this. So it started off actually on one dedicated server, some random server company in Canada where it was hosted. And that server very quickly ran into limits. I mean, I guess you can handle maybe like 30 requests a second or something on one server. So I probably ran into that after a few weeks or a month or something. And that was about the time that Amazon EC2 came out. So the time or that was starting to become a mature technology. So I started transitioning over to this, and I know nothing about running servers or scaling servers. So I had like my database servers on EC2, my web server on this random server in Canada, and I'm sending all the data back and forth across the internet, which doesn't work. So I had scaling issues pretty quickly. So when you keep saying I had scaling issues, how long was it just you building this? Like, how long until you realized, hey, I need some help, or was there someone else from the start?
I want to say it was like 2 years before I started actual company off it, before there were other people involved. So yeah, I ran it for myself for a really long time, which really consisted of me figuring out how to scale servers, because there wasn't a lot of information about that at the time. Because not many people had ever had to scale anything until the Facebook platform.
So that's a long time. At what point did you start charging people or somehow getting people to give you money in order to play this game?
So in the early days of Facebook, the revenue model was advertising, purely advertising. Free to play was not really a thing on Facebook. I think maybe Zynga was kind of touching on it with Zynga Poker, but free to play as we know it today didn't exist for the way we thought about games here. I'm sure it existed in China long before that, but we just never thought about it here. So I really wasn't making any money for a very long time. Well, very long in Facebook world scale. I think I had like 80,000 DAU, and I was barely paying my server costs. So it really didn't make money until someone from Super Rewards, does anyone know the company Super Rewards? They're like a payment processor very early on Facebook, and they emailed me and we had a talk about, hey, you should really integrate super rewards to this game that you have. It'll probably do well. So I was like, so I looked into what it was, and I looked into how other people were integrating it. And the way they were integrating it didn't make any sense. The way I saw it, it seemed wrong, because basically they were selling, if you were level 20 in the game, they were selling you the same amount of virtual currency as if you were level 2. And that didn't seem right, because I knew that my level 20 players, valued that they needed a lot more currency for it to be valuable to them. So I just made a system to sell favor points, which were converted into actual game currency. And that turned out to be the big innovation that led to a lot of the games that we see today, that like Mafia Wars and things like that. And all of the free-to-play games, that's how they work. They're not selling the same thing to anyone. They're targeting specific things to the players that care about it most.
So, so you started making money at this point, and did you have funding up until this point? Were you just kind of living cheap and coding into the night, and or did you receive funding from somewhere, like an investor or something like that?
There were no investors involved. I was making enough to pay my rent. And I also had some money saved. I recommend anyone who's really planning to go forward developing a game for real, save some money, because you're probably not going to make money for a while. Even my story is kind of an outlier in that regard. It's hard to make money off games. Yeah.
Okay. Succinct. So what was your biggest challenge? Was it figuring out what to build? Was it the scaling? Something we haven't talked about yet?
It's something we haven't talked about yet. So my biggest challenge, I think, was there's this whole legal side to what happened. I don't know if anyone knows the history of any of this, but I had 3 lawsuits happening at the same time. Which is not fun. Anytime people kind of know that you're making money, any reason they have to go after you to get a piece of that, they will go after you, even if they're your friends. So that was the hardest thing to deal with. Is the company I used to work for was suing me, saying this game was ours because I developed it while I was working there, even though it was developed in my own time. That doesn't matter. And I didn't know this. I learned all of this stuff the hard way. But that was probably the hardest thing, because I had this very exciting thing that I was investing my entire life into, trying to make it work, trying to keep it growing, trying to keep my servers alive. And all of a sudden, there's these people who were my friends telling me that this is our game, this is ours, we own this, that's how the law works, we're sorry. So I obviously would not accept that and just kept fighting it and fighting it and fighting it, and that's not fun because that takes away your focus. On the other hand, I had Zynga and Playdom who had cloned the game, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but they copied the game very closely. And I didn't like that, so I had lawsuits against them. So yeah, none of these things are fun, and none of these things I wanted as a result of developing a game, but it happened, and that was by far the most challenging thing.
And
So how did you finance your lawsuit?
At the point that the lawsuits were really kicked off, I was making enough to afford lawyers, which is not fun either. You don't want all your money to be going to lawyers, but
How would you do things differently now from how you did them back then?
first of all, I would quit my job before developing the game. And I think that would have been the single biggest thing I could have done, because then it would have been focused purely on building my game. I think the first lawsuit really led to this path of focusing on something I didn't want to be focused on. And when you're one person building something, the competition like Zynga and Playdom, these are real serious companies, and they will run you over, and they did. And not that I would have built Zynga or something if that had been the case. I don't think I would have. I didn't want to start a company until much later. But in terms of kind of just things that I wish had been different, I think that would be the main one.
So obviously having the Facebook platform really helped you grow from, they provided an audience that was pretty, there wasn't that much choice at the time, which really helped you. So do you think there are similar opportunities now in, Facebook, or in some platform out there? Or do you think it's, and obviously they've changed a lot of their policies about how you can contact other friends and things like that. But do you think, what do you think about mobile or other platforms?
So yeah, my current company is 100% mobile based. So obviously the answer to that is mobile. But it's a very different opportunity. I haven't seen like viral stuff on mobile actually work. Maybe some people have gotten to work, but I haven't seen it or I'm not aware of it. But the opportunity on mobile is that people actually want games on mobile. People didn't want games on Facebook. It was almost like this weird novelty that just attracted so many people due to this viral exploit of the platform, and not really because people are like, I really want to play Farmville. And I think things like Farmville eventually evolved into serious games that people really enjoy playing, but it didn't start out that way. It was just almost purely like this viral thing where you just had so many users. If you can get like 1 million people a day to download your game, I don't care what it is, it's going to make money. So that's kind of where it started. But mobile is really interesting because you have the platforms actually want to introduce your game to people. They actually want to promote your game to a lot of people. Like hundreds of thousands of people a day will download your game if like Apple or Google promotes it.
I'm sure you learned some things about either human nature or technology that you didn't expect. Maybe, the way people reacted, when you changed something in the game, or I'm just wondering, what are the strange things that you learned while building this game? Or while scaling the game, actually, since it only took you 2 weeks to build it.
I'll try to answer the first question. One of the things that's interesting about a game like Mob Wars is that you have this live user base, and they live to play this game. Like a lot of these people, that's like what gets them up in the morning is like playing this game. They're just so into it. Even Mob Wars isn't even like the best designed game out there. It's just a game that's mafia themed, and people like that. So when people are investing so much time into their characters and into this world, and you change something, they just go nuts. They hate anything that changes. Whether no matter how much thought you put into it, they hate it, at least initially. So I had all these ways of changing things that wouldn't make people angry. Like literally, if I wanted to change a value from like 10 to 20, I had this code that I just hack in there that would basically make it go from 10 to 20 over the course of like 2 months. That's how slowly I had to like tweak these values so that people wouldn't get upset. And even then they notice, like they'll email you and
Like what kind of value would you change?
So when you make a game that quickly, it's not balanced, it's not well designed. So when you start realizing all these flaws in the game that you just launched, you have to fix them somehow. And the only way to really do it is like ratchet down the values, like you're tweaking it. Or you can just do the rip off the Band-Aid approach, which tends to lose users. So yeah, there's really no good way to change a game after you've launched it that I've figured out.
Did you consider just launching another game that used the similar mechanics and then somehow like advertising it on the original? Or did you launch another game? Was that the only game you developed for a while?
So actually, I initially let a bunch of my friends use the code, and I just gave them the code and said re-theme it, and launched a few games like that. But even by the time that happened, the viral channels of Facebook were turned down so much that those games didn't do as well, even though a lot of them were actually better games than the ones that I built in terms of design. But they just didn't have the user base or the traction, and maybe the themes played into it. There was like a World of Warcraft type themed one, a Ninja themed one, and a few others that I can't even remember. But yeah, they didn't do as well for whatever reason.
Well, I only have one other question that I wrote down that I could think of, so definitely gonna open it up. I wanted to ask, so what are you working on now?
So I have a company, a small company, 8 people in San Francisco, and we just like making games. And we're making mobile games, and I think the level of where mobile game development is right now, an 8-person team can build anything that you see on the mobile platform right now. There's no huge projects on there. So we're working on a player-to-player RTS game where you build an army and send your army into someone else's base. And it's been really fun to build a game that I consider more of like an actual game with characters that move around and swing swords and shoot arrows, and it's been the most fun I've had developing a game for a long time. This is the second mobile game that Metamoki made. The game is very simple. You're just connecting together these fruits as fast as you can. The faster you connect them, the more points you get. What keeps me in games to begin with is that it's really hard to make it work, and I think it might take me like at least 5 more years to figure out how it's going to work, how it works, how to actually build good games consistently, where just every game we build is like a PopCap or a Blizzard, where you never see a bad game get released from that company. It's always impressive what they release, and I think I'd like to be there, where I just have an understanding of how to not only build games, but how to get groups of people to build games really well. And that's been my greatest challenge. I mean, like, building a game on your own is completely different than building a game with a team of people. And I'd really like to be able to master that.